Hello, this is the Pixelsmith, and today I'm going to show you how to make swooshes. Someone asked me on one of the Facebook groups that I belong to how I make the swooshes that I use sometimes. And it's actually just a series of effects. It's not really that complex compared to some other techniques, but it's actually pretty fun. So let me show you this one, timeline, preview. That's all it really is. It's basically a swoosh just rolling around a path. I'm going to show you how to make the path that I use. It's an interesting little feature that After Effects has that a lot of people don't realize is here. And most of it is just a series of about 4 effects. And really, you could probably get away with 2 effects, but I added a few more. So if I open my effects controls panel, which is window effect controls, this swoosh layer, which is just basically just a solid layer, is created by a particle system 2 effect, roughen edges, Gaussian blur, and curves. And really, you could probably do it with just the first 2 effects. I use Gaussian blur and curves just to kind of improve the smoothness a little bit, but depends on what kind of look you're going for. So I'll just make a new composition. I'll just grab all this, drop it into a new folder. I'll call it original. So I'll just make a new comp. I'm going to call this one swoosh. And I'm using 1080 by 1080, which is basically just the Instagram square size in the feed. So you can make it whatever size you want. It doesn't really care. Now, the first thing I'm actually going to do, I'll just close this comp. First thing I'm actually going to do is make the path that I want it to follow. This is not necessary to make the swoosh, but it's a lot easier to make a path and have the swoosh follow it than it is to manually try to animate the movement of the swoosh. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use a feature built into the program that a lot of people don't realize is even here, which is always fun. Window, I'm going to open the Create Nulls from Paths. I forget which version of the program introduced this feature, maybe 2017, maybe 2018, I don't know, it's been around for a while though. What it basically lets you do is take a vector path, either one that you convert from an imported Illustrator file or Photoshop file, or in this case I'm just going to draw it with the pen tool, and it lets you basically use that to create nulls. There's 3 options. The points will follow the nulls. The null objects control the shape of the path. Nulls follow points, that it's the position of the vertices, what most of the programs call anchor points along the path, and the nulls will follow that. And that can be a lot of fun, by the way, too. But what I want to use is the one called trace path. So let's get going and make a path. I'm going to move it over to the side so I can actually see what I'm doing. I'm going to use the pen tool, and I've got nothing here, so it's going to make a new shape. I've got my fill turned to none, and I've got my stroke as white, but it's not going to be visible, so in this case, it doesn't really matter. So the 20 pixel stroke is mostly irrelevant. And I've got Roto Bezier turned on for my pen. It just makes it a little easier to make nice smooth curves. I mean, you don't need it. You can just turn it off and make a regular Bezier path, but it literally auto smooths your line. I'm going to use it in this case. I'm going to start outside of my shape, start over here. I'm just clicking to make straight lines. Now, normally that would make straight lines. I'll click on the third, Roto Bezier kicks in, and I get a nice smooth curve. The idea for this is don't make too many points. There and there. And it auto smooths as I move the points around. So if I take the pen tool and hover back over the vertices, it'll auto smooth itself. So I can just adjust it, give myself a slightly different curve. If I want more points, I can just hover over the path and I can just drag them along again. And again, as I keep adjusting these point positions, the program will automatically smooth it off. That's what Roto Bezier does. Or Bezier, or I'm not French. Don't hold that against me, please. So again, if I want to add more points, no problem at all. I can just go grab more points. And it basically adjusts the path automatically, so you're going to have to tweak it until you get what you like. No problem at all. Okay. That should work for this example. If you wanted to remove a point, by the way, so then they say you put one on by accident, if you just highlight the point and then just hit delete, it's not like Illustrator or Photoshop where that would actually break the path. Deleting a vertex from here, they're actually called vertices here. Vertex, if you're only dealing with one of them, vertices, you're talking about all of them at once. Deleting a vertex here doesn't break open a path, it simply removes that vertex. It's kind of like the equivalent of the remove anchor point tool in Photoshop. So this path is only for reference purposes. It's what the swoosh is going to follow. So I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it motion path. So there's a shape layer. So for this effect to work right now, it'll fail it. It says no path selected. Here's what I got to do. I've got to open the layer to reveal its contents and transform property. I've got to reveal contents. each shape on a shape layer is going to be listed here. Shape 1, shape 2. If we use a rectangle, say rectangle, that sort of thing. I'm going to open shape. I'm going to open path. I'm looking for the actual path property, the one that actually has the stopwatch. I highlight that, and now trace path will work. So this motion path was only there to do that one thing. It needs to stay. I can't just delete it because changing the motion path will actually change how the null that's following it moves. So now I have this null object following the path exactly like this. And then I can just basically make whatever I want, the child of that null, and now we have things moving in complex paths pretty easily. I'm going to close the panel because now it's useless. But like I said, I can't adjust the path's vertices, change up the path, and the null will just adjust. So it's a live effect, so don't delete the path. I'm going to collapse it, and I'm going to hide it. Doesn't have to be visible, it's just here for the reference. Okay. Now, this is a personal thing. I like setting the anchor point of my nulls to 50-50. So a null is 100 pixels wide. I like setting the anchor point to 50-50, so it's right in the middle. That's a personal preference. It does not affect anything about this at all. I don't like the color of the null, so I'm just going to change the label color. I'll make it yellow. It's easier to see against the black like that. Again, nulls are invisible when you render. They're just helper objects. And this one is just here so that I can have something, so I can follow that path. So I can do a couple other things. What the trace path command does is adds an effect to the new null called trace path. It automatically gives you 1 second of animation, so there's 2 keyframes on the progress property. That's what makes the null move. So if you want to slow it down, just grab the keyframe, pull it further out. Want to speed it up, closer together. But the other thing it does is auto loops. I don't know why auto loop is on by default, but it is. So I'm going to turn it off. I don't want it to actually loop. So I want it to run through once. And if you want it to loop, just leave that option on. Now again, the only point of this is that I now have the something that my swoosh can follow. And it's just a lot easier than trying to keyframe complex animation to do that. So have fun with it. Layer, new. I'm going to make a new solid layer. So I don't really care much about the color. If I want to change the color of the swoosh, I'm just going to set that with like a fill effect or something. So whatever color you make here is fine. If you want it to be orange or white or black or blue, no one cares at all. It's up to you. I'm going to always change the colors later, so it's not really a big deal for me. But I do want to make it the comp size. It's 1080 by 1080 again. Say, okay, the effect I'm going to use is one of the particle systems. It's actually CC Particle System 2. I haven't used Particle Playground in years. It's one of like the older effects. So I pretty much went into Simple Particle System 2 from Psycore. And when I need more complex particles, I'll use Particle World. It has a lot more options. But all I really need is to make a single, all I need to make is a single emitter point. And it's a little easier to do with Particle System in that case. I'm just going to apply that to my solids highlight. It's a double click. I need to see the position path of the null. So highlight it and I tapped P on my keyboard. And I need to see the effect. I need to see its producer and its producer position. I'm going to hold down Option on my Mac. It's Alt on Windows. Click on the stopwatch so I can actually reveal my expression. So I added an expression by Option clicking or Alt clicking on a stopwatch. I'm just going to pull my timeline up a little bit so I can see this a little better. I need to see both the position property with the expression and the position property of the null. I'm just going to use the expression pick whip to connect the producer's position to the position of the null. That's what it writes out for me. And if I really wanted to, I could have written that out myself, but I've got better things to do. So I click outside of the expression text field, it's done. And we've now wired the producer's position to the position of the null. So now the producer does this. It follows the null like that. I'm gonna leave it there for now. So I'm gonna close the properties of the solid and I'm gonna rename the solid swoosh. I know it doesn't look like swoosh yet, but that'll be fixed in a little bit. So basically, you could use this if you wanted a flame trail, you could use it if you wanted anything at all. No problem, have fun. I want to make a swoosh though. So I'm going to change some of the settings on the particle. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lower the longevity. It's going to die a lot faster. I'll start with 1. I'm going to bump up the birth rate. I'm going to do about 7, I think, for this. Because I want to make a lot of them at the beginning and have them pretty much die off. I think I actually might make the longevity 0.5. So I'm going to make the producer a little smaller. Instead of 3 by 3, I'm going to make it 1 pixel by 1 pixel. I need to clump together. In general, the particles kind of shoot away really fast. Animation explosive is fine. That's not the problem. The problem is the velocity. I'm going to lower the velocity so it's really low. Okay, for the record, yes, the number starts at 1. You go to decimal values. So I'm going to make it like 0.1 velocity. Now, that's going to basically make it really, really, really tight. It's not shooting away as quickly. That's still not enough for me. I'm going to reduce gravity to 0. I want to follow that path really, really pretty tightly. And then I'm going to raise the resistance. This is actually the important part, raising the resistance. The resistance basically forces them to stay really close together in a clump together. I'm going to drop down to the particle area, and I'm going to get rid of lines. And I'm going to go with lens convex in this case. That's my lens convex, okay? I want the birth size to be high. I'm going to bring it up to like, not that high, by the way. I'm thinking 1, basically. And I want the depth size to be really low. So I want it to get smaller as it gets further away. So the particles are always measured from birth to death. What do they look like when they are first created, and what do they look like when they cease to exist? The longevity controls their lifespan. That's why it's called longevity, by the way. Yes, a little freaky, but that's how they did it. Size variation, I want to reduce that to 0. I don't want the size to vary. I want it to actually be what I'm setting. Okay. And again, you can go much higher than 1 for the burst size. So if you want a really big starting point, I mean, no problem at all. So maybe I'll do like 1.5 in this case. And yes, 1.5 is actually a very large number when thinking about particles. Okay. I'm going to lower the longevity a bit more, so maybe 0.2. And notice that gives me a much, much smaller blobby area. If I raise the resistance even higher, because I can go really pretty high with this, it's going to clump more and more closer together. I'm going to do about 115 on my timeline. I'm going to tap in to drag the end of my work area bar to it, so I can just preview this area. So now you can see I've got this kind of like swooshy thing moving around that spiral that I made. But it's not really that swooshy. It's not smooth. It's really kind of bumpy and jagged. So the particles are literally emitting individual little circles effectively. Now, the problem with that is that the individual little circles are not forming a single coherent edge. So what I want to do is actually add an effect that'll let me do that. And I'm going to add an effect that doesn't seem that it would do this, but there's a very interesting effect called roughen edges. And I forget who I first learned this from. It actually might have been either Marriot, who has a really excellent YouTube channel, or it actually might have been Evan Abrams. I don't know. I forget. It was some tutorial I watched had this, and it was like, that's a pretty cool idea. And there's a lot of ways that you can do this, and I'm going to do actually several of them here to make this really nice and smooth. So I'm just going to apply this to my swoosh. I'm going to leave the edge, type it roughen. Yes, it's weird that something called roughen is going to smooth this, but it will. Okay. And then what I want to do is I want to adjust the settings of this. I'm going to bump the border up really high. I think somewhere around 40 is actually what I'm going to do. Now, I end up with these like really, really kind of rough edges, which is, for the record, maybe it's kind of cool. Maybe you want to actually kind of like make like a comet moving, which is cool. Fine. In that case, leave it here. We're good. But I want to do a few more things. The edge sharpness, I'm going to bump up a bit, so it's a nice rough edge. Actually, no, I think I'll leave it at 1. I'll leave it at 1. Hold on. Okay, I'm going to take the fractal influence down. That's actually going to really start to smooth it off. So the higher the fractal influence, the rougher the edge is. Lower fractal influences give you really, really, really smooth edges. And then I'm going to take the scale up above 100 so that it just rounds off the edge a little bit more. It's kind of cool. And again, you can play with that. There's a stretch width or height setting here. Maybe that'll give you something nice. In this case, I didn't do it. And again, I could leave it at this and we're good to go. So if you wanted to, you could leave it right here. And if that's the kind of like pretty smooth swoosh you want, no problem at all. Because remember, it's going to be in motion, so the fact that it's not exactly a perfect curve isn't necessarily a big deal. But I actually want to go a little further, so I'm going to collapse roughen edges, and I'm actually going to put on a Gaussian blur effect. And I don't know whether it's pronounced Gaussian or whatever. It's that one, basically. And I'm not using the legacy one because the newer one basically takes a lot less memory and has the repeat edge pixels option, so when it gets to the edge and you blur it, you don't lose the edge, so I'll turn that on. I'm going to bump the blurriness really high. Like, insanely high. Like, 100 high. And for the record, it goes higher than 100. So it all depends on how much you want to smooth it off. I'll use 100. That should work fine for what I'm doing. Now, the result of this is that I now have a blurry swoosh, which is not what I want. And don't ever use Gaussian blur to mimic motion blur. They aren't the same thing at all. So I'm going to toss on one more effect, and it's called curves. Now, a lot of you may know curves for its color correction features, because that's what it does usually, color correction. But what you may not know is that it can actually be set to target the alpha channel, the actual transparency channel. So if I go to curves, change my channel that I'm working with from the master, which is RGB, to alpha, this curve controls the transparency. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the curve really, really, really steep. And the steeper I make it, I'm basically forcing the transparent pixels to choose to be not transparent anymore. So I'm making them not transparent. I don't want a perfectly vertical line, because if I do that, it gets really, really choppy. And that's not usually what I'm looking for. If you look closely, it's really kind of choppy. So a slight curve is actually a little good for this. And now when I preview that, I've got a pretty decent smooth edge. It gets a little wonky around the corners a little bit because of the way the blur runs. So normally what I do is I basically just take the swoosh layer and scale it up a little bit. Maybe just like 105%. So I don't lose it when it runs on the edges. And that's how I make my nice, cute swooshes.